that IDB or the ICB does for the public sector. Talking about philanthropy, Dr. Sidi, just an example, and maybe in the second round I can go into giving more examples. Again, here I really applaud the work that was initiated by His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Muhammad Ali. We had a partnership between the Islamic Development Bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We established what we call the LLF, which is the Life and Livelihood Fund. And that's a fund aims at 3 areas. One of them is for preventing diseases such as polio, AIDS, malaria, etc. The second target is what we call small farmers and agriculture. So here again, we're looking into job creation. And the third area is into the rural infrastructure. So we're looking at renewable, off-grid, etc. And we thank Allah that we managed to also bring partners. The Saudi government through King Salman Center, they contribute about 100 million. Qatar Development Fund for 50 million. Abu Dhabi Fund 50 million. And Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, 100 million. 100 million from the Gates Foundation and 100 million from the ISDB. This is an example of a partnership between government, public, philanthropy, and definitely we'll be bringing private sector contribution in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Saati. It's clear that the achievement of SDGs requires much money than what is available with the FIs. So let me now turn to Mr. Florian. Florian, you are a managing partner of a private impact fund.
Yes.
So what will be the incentives a private investor would look at to contribute to the achievement of SDGs?
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much also for AGFUND for the invitation here. So Bamboo Capital Partners, we are a impact investing fund, asset manager. We're Luxembourg-based. We basically deploy our capital exclusively to benefit low-income population in emerging markets. We do that around Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We do mainly 3 sectors. One is financial inclusion, what we're discussing also here. So it's helping to bank unbanked people, but we do that on the private equity side, not debt. We do access to energy, namely lots in off-grid solar. We've invested in quite a large amount of companies. Then we also do access to healthcare. And where we originally started was, we did not start with government money. We did pure private money, looking at the low-income population and seeing what is needed to move the needles. And in order to move the needle, we look at 2 problems, access and affordability of basically half of the world's population. So when looking at that, we looked at what is needed, how can we support when investing in commercial companies, so creating local infrastructure to basically create wealth and infrastructure to service and to provide goods and services to the low-income population in emerging markets. And over now 11 years, we have seen a lot and learned a lot. We have, from a private equity standpoint, learned where models did not work. But whenever we were basically investing in an area where industry was following, that worked from a financial return. Because the social returns, we measure the financial and the social returns in parallel. Our social returns are published a similar way. Once a year, we have our impact report, which is a widely read report in the industry when it comes to showing on the impact side. Of course, when we started, there were no Sustainable Development Goals. So once that was announced, it was actually a great theme for us, basically to look at what does it mean, and also to give some names or a clear focus on what we're doing. So we're covering 10 of the 17 SDGs by default, what we're doing. Now, specifically what is interesting, as we started off only doing private, we basically differentiate between 2 different impact investing. You have the impact first funds, where you basically want to have at least the money back, some moderate returns. You take a higher risk because the primary goal you want to achieve is to impact people. And we measure that, and we also measured by the Global Impact Investing Networks, Gears Rating, IRIS, and these other parts where we have also provided some information. And then the others are commercial impact investing, where you see a lot of big asset managers now moving or starting to move into this space of impact investing. But the big challenge are the impact first funds. Because usually when we are going to some development finance institutions, you know, the D is a smaller one and the F is a little bit bigger. So therefore, if you don't show market returns of your initiative because you have an impact first fund, it does not apply. And very often it's difficult to get the support. Now, what we have seen over time is when reaching out to the non-for-profit money, whether philanthropy, grants, that opens another door in order to move the needle here. So from that end, where we're seeing now coming programs up, we have we got chosen by CARE International, you might be familiar with, you know, on their initiative to move from philanthropy now and from the aid work into impact investing. They've chosen us to be their partner to do the first series of funds, of impact first funds, where they actually provide a first loss and then we raise the commercial capital on top in order be able to come in earlier into social businesses to take them forward to commercial.
Thank you. Now we have listened to the views of an international organization and the private sector. Let us now hear from the social business people. So, Mr. Venan, can you share with us your experience in the area of financial inclusion? What works and what does?
Well, I come from a background, I'm an environmental scientist and have actually worked on the business side as well as on the environmental impact assessment side. Coming from PwC, where I was heading the sustainability and climate change practice in West Africa, and then working with EnviroFit as well, doing business development for them for their range of clean technology across West Africa. And now for Change, which is more like an organization we developed to try to kind of bridge the gap. It's a change, innovation, and transformation entity that tries to understand and implement ESG factors across businesses, helping them to improve on their operational efficiency and profitability. Florian just mentioned the fact that most of the social business, there's always that space where you need to prove impact because everybody wants to invest in impact, and if you can't actually have the support to be able to prove an impact and then be able to kind of attract the funding to scale, most of them generally burn out. So I would name a couple of examples. I would start with EnviroFit. They had the biomass clean cook stoves, which we're kind of trying to market in Ghana, for example. But the products were generally, they're very good, everybody loves them. But when you go to the market and someone comes and says, yeah, what's the price? It's 250 cedis, oh, I can't afford that. But can you give me credit for it? But I don't know you. But then when you go to the bank and say, can you, the bank, be able to help these guys afford this and they pay back to you gradually? Like some would actually say, well, we abide to IFC charters. We don't do anything that has to do with charcoal, so we can't work with you. Some would say, well, the return is too low. We can't even start considering it because the amount of effort that we would invest in actually giving out a 250 loan is the same as the amount of effort that I would invest in giving out a 2,000 CD loan. So why bother? And so it became very difficult until we got to the Village and Service and Loans Associations that actually started off from CARE International. Basically, communities that come together and mobilize themselves and give loans to each other. And we had a little success in it where they will buy 10 and then pay off the 10 and then buy another 20 and pay off the 20. So EnviroFit realized that anyway, everybody wants to transition from charcoal to LPG, right? Before long, my customers would not be charcoal users, to be LPG users. So how can I actually get them, those who would afford only 1 CD charcoal a day, because that's all they can afford? If you tell them to buy a cylinder of gas, which is about 70, 75 CDs, you're telling them to buy gas for 2 months. So they will say, but why should I buy gas for 2 months when I can actually afford only 1 CD a day for charcoal? So the idea to kind of bridge that gap was give them a gas cylinder, but then have a smart gas model on it where they can actually, because of digital finance and kind of mobile money pay as you go, you can actually pay with 1 CD and have access to gas for one city. And so they don't need to actually buy the whole cylinder to be able to cook, but they can actually pay as they cook and actually still pay the one city that they used to pay for the charcoal. So that is actually being tested commercially now in Kenya, and it's working perfectly. And on the side of the social business, there was this young guy who developed a model. It's called Zakol in Ghana. It is basically using coconut husk to make charcoal. But his problem was his charcoal was too expensive for the local market because his technology was actually, the cost of technology was too high. And so he's kind of trying, how can he actually bring down his production process, reduce the cost of his production process to be able to sell the charcoal cheaper. It never really worked out until he was admitted into the Ghana Climate Innovation Center, which is, I'm kind of talking about the kind of support that social businesses actually have. The Climate Innovation Center actually was designed to kind of help social and climate entrepreneurs scale up their businesses by providing some form of grant and incubation, all through to a commercialization eventually. And until he got to GIC, the Ghana Climate Innovation Center, where he got a grant of about $50,000 to be able to invest in the technology that he needed. And in 6 months, he was able to prove to one of the supermarkets in Accra, ShopRite, that he can actually produce in the kind of commercial scale that they would want. And his products are now in the supermarket just because he got that grant. So what really happens is most of the social businesses just need a little bit of support to be able to scale. But ever so often, everybody wants to kind of see a great impact, a big impact to be able to invest in, because the investors actually have people backing them because they want to kind of see the impact. But then where can we actually find a middle way to be able to support the social business actually scale in a way that is sustainable? And not just social businesses, you have even the big kind of, talking about Diageo, for example, or Guinness, and Nestle, for example, where they were importing grain from abroad because the quality of the grain of the farmers in Ghana was not very good. But then they kind of flipped their model in, okay, fine. If we can get these farmers, if we can improve on the quality of the grain, right, then we don't need to import grain. And what did they do? They actually work with the farmers. I think they used to work with, I think it's Root Capital or something. I think Root Capital actually worked with them. And they improved on the quality of the grain of the farmers. And before long, they were actually off-takers of the grain of the farmers. And that reduced their importation cost for grain. And if you see all that, everything that they did actually contributed towards access to finance for the farmers to be able to have more money, they have quality of health, education, and then that actually touches on several factors of SDGs. So it's more or less, how can you package? How can you develop models? New models have to be developed because business is changing. Even the businesses actually know that they have to change their market models to be able to attract more customers. And those that actually understand it are doing it so that they can actually get access to more markets in the rural areas, for example. And generally, those that understand it, those that understand the fact that we can actually integrate all this within our business operations, is basically just business as usual, but then actually making a return out of it eventually. And that is how it's going to go in the years to come.
Thank you very much. To have the full picture about SDGs achievement in Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in West and Central Africa, we really need some data. And OECD is a knowledge-based institution. So I would like to ask Jens if you can share with us some data about financial inclusion worldwide, and particularly in West and Central African, and also some data about the funding of SDGs, the requirement, and the available ODA, and how to fill the gap through private sector involvement.
Thank you very much. I'll do my best. So I think we already heard a reference that ODA per annum is about close to 150 billion US dollars at this point in time, which is a lot of money. What I can say initially is that I think over the last years, the amount of that ODA that went to financial sector development and financial inclusion was about 6 billion per year. So it's quite a sizable chunk of that resources. Maybe just to complement also, in a survey that we do of global philanthropies, we found that they add another about 100 million per year to that sector. And interestingly also, we've been doing survey of the private finance mobilized into financing of those objectives. And again, over the 4 years, 2012 to 2015, that added up to about, again, roughly 6 billion per year. Now, as you rightly said, I think, or as was mentioned here, the financing gap for meeting the SDGs is at a completely different order of magnitude. Somebody say 2.5 billion, somebody says 3 billion. Nobody really knows. I think it's impossible to know, but it's definitely a different order of magnitude. And obviously, it's not going to be met just by public or official international development finance. So I think that makes it clear that that is essential to have to mobilize different resources. And I think that was very clear, strong message. In the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, where it talked about the mobilization of resources. And clearly, the mobilization of private resources is essential. I would say there's, the point is coming back again to the cost. It's the SDGs. It's not a cost; it's an investment. So it's something that pays back more than you put into it. And at the same time, there are huge amounts of money flushing around financial markets. I mean, the amount of liquidity out there is stupendous in some way, and the average returns are very minimal. So I think a basic idea is to say, if you could just succeed in channeling some of that money towards real economy needs in developing countries, you could go a very long way in actually meeting the needs that are out there. Now, there are a number of challenges that relate certainly to the enabling environment, which I think is the biggest overall challenge. They relate to capacity issues, question of project pipelines, and having bankable investment opportunities. But they also, I think, relate to the role that development finance institutions play and have traditionally played. And I think there's an important shift that is slowly taking place, but that needs to take place more consciously and more deliberately for donors essentially to turn from being a sort of provider of financing to being a facilitator of financing. When they actually say, where we can, we want to basically enable to use our money catalytically to grow the overall financing pie. And that can be done through grants, that can be done through structured products, that can be done through equity investments or whatever. But I think that's a very important mind shift that has to happen in the financing for development space.
Thank you very much. The Islamic Development Bank Group has been successful in launching many initiatives which contributed to the MDGs achievement. And we can talk about the many initiatives launched by the Islamic Development Bank for Africa, and the special program for the development of Africa. So let me ask Brother Saati, from your experience in Sub-Saharan Africa, what can be the main impediment which hampers the involvement of the private sector in funding SDGs in Sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in West and Central Africa?
Good, thanks. As it was mentioned by you good self and the colleagues, we agree that there is a huge financing gap which has to be filled somehow by the private sector. Now, maybe in the sessions this morning, we heard, and also His Excellency Brother Nasser talked about bank accounts, this issue about bank accounts. Some data, and again, maybe data sometimes could be interpreted one way or the other. There is about 1.7 billion people worldwide who have no bank account. Now, what are the reasons for that? Maybe it's about regulation, it could be about accessibility, etc. Even sometimes, we don't want to dwell into religion. Even religion sometimes has something to do with this. And hence, for example, Islamic finance has provided some I would say, solutions into Sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world by using Islamic microfinance, which is similar that AGFUND is doing, and we're doing partnership with them. Even the use of other solutions such as Awqaf, which is endowment. It has been a successful tool in creating, I would say, additional financial space. Even the use of what we call the zakat, which is the like what we give. It's like not tax, but it's in the Muslim word, the zakat. It can be used also to also bridge. For example, today the ISLB and the UNDP, they're developing a program whereby we're utilizing zakat for renewable energy. So this is just an example. Now, talking about this issue about gap, talking about this issue about regulation, we all agree that about the access to finance. We all agree about the social inclusion. Hence, we're talking about microfinance, we're talking about SMEs, different ways and means of doing that. Since you're talking about like we had a program which we call the SPDA, the Special Program for Development of Africa. And that was a program where the Islamic Development Bank Group went into Africa for a program over 5 years. And we had a target, if I recall, of about 5 billion, but we did exceed that target into maybe 8 billion or so. It did not come all from the IDB group, but it came also from partners through co-financing, parallel financing, etc., etc. So it was one of the most successful experiences that we had as a group in Africa. And by the way, we try to replicate this in Central Asia, where we have a program called SPCA, Special Program for the Development of Central Asia. This is just maybe one example. I can maybe go into another area which we're exploring into specifically for Africa. Now we're looking into this issue about value chain, and I'm sure this is a terminology that everybody is fully aware of. I used to give, just maybe to personalize, I used to go to Sudan frequently. And I visited many parts of Sudan, and last night even over dinner we were talking about mango and grapefruit in Sudan. You'd be amazed, those of you who live in Sudan, have been to Sudan, that I live in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, which is less than 1 hour and 20 minutes flight from Khartoum. By the way, it's shorter than going to Riyadh, our capital. And grapefruit, which is abundant in Sudan, we don't find it in Saudi Arabia, whereby we find grapefruit that comes from Brazil, comes from Pakistan, and all of that. Same thing with mango and all of that. And when you go to Sudan, to the source of that, unfortunately, you see this very valuable, I would say, commodity, food, etc. I don't want to use the word neglected, but this issue about and that's an example of whereby private sector, public sector, everybody, even small farmers, they can work in a value chain in the development of that one. I give this example, and by the way, this year in our annual meeting in Tunisia, we had an initiative with 10 Sub-Saharan countries into rice production, whereby we're going into a value chain, where we involve everybody, the private sector, public sector, etc., whereby we'll have self-sufficiency in these countries, and also we have abundance for export and all of that. I'll just give maybe one last example. Also, through working with philanthropy and private sector, we have a program that was initiated many years ago and started in Africa, which is the anti-blindness program. It started very modest by only volunteerism from some doctors and some institutions. This year, we were targeting a second phase of this program. We were only targeting 25 million, and we thought that resource mobilization for 25 million is just too much. You would be surprised that we were able to have partners for 10 times this amount, 245 million for the second phase of this program, which is anti-blindness, whereby we conduct surgeries for cataract, etc., provision. By the way, the private sector, they provide glasses. So we have more than 1.5, I would say, million eyeglasses provided by the private sector, by NGOs, etc., etc. These are examples. If you just allow me, I'll end with one note, which is about localization. And this is about, we're talking about job creation, opportunities, etc., etc. What do I mean by localization? And again, I don't want to get into politics, but this is very important. We're here in Europe, and we're hearing about the problems about migration, or illegal migration, which every country in Europe and the world is facing. Illegal migration from parts of the world, Africa, etc., etc. So the idea is very simple. What about localizing these industries from Europe and other worlds locally in Africa. So it could be whether it's in different things. It could be food, it could be industry and all of that, whereby we establish the factories, the plants in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and Africa, and whereby we can provide jobs, raw materials are over there. That way we prevent this issue about illegal migration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are some maybe food for thought that we can all together, public, private sector, and all of that. But it all comes with regulation, capacity development, training, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Saati. Now, I would like to come back to Mr. Venan. What are the model of business, social business you will promote for the private sector involvement in funding the SDGs in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, it's kind of really tricky because the bottom line is if you can look at the number of startups you have in most of Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, you have so many of them, but they understand that they can actually take the challenges they have and kind of convert them into opportunities. The opportunities are many, but the problem ever so often is how can they be supported kind of to go through that very difficult early stage funding where there is hardly any funding available, right? Then to be able to get to a point where they would not burn out, but then be able to actually scale and actually create the impact that they want to create. So there are general models, for example. I will quote one which I think has been able to work successfully. It was a small organization that basically focused on waste. And it tried to work with some of the private sector entities to help them segregate their waste and work with schools as well to kind of educate the schools about segregating their waste. And so what they did was they would come to you, they would go to the private sector, take their waste, and then they'll recycle some of the paper and then give it back to the private sector entity as toilet roll, for example, that they can use in their offices. And that basically creates that culture of ownership, because the employees actually feel like, okay, we're using this paper because we're able to recycle, segregate our paper in our offices, and this is the toilet roll that we're using. We're not buying extra toilet roll. We're actually cost saving by not buying toilet roll. All we invested in is for this organization to be able to actually do more by actually replicating the model in very many other organizations. Those are kind of small things that really work, but you can't really scale it. They also tried with plastics, but then you know where plastic recycling is going at the moment. China is not buying recycled plastics anymore. And so the whole price actually slumped. And so you can recycle you want, but then it's actually even more valuable to use virgin plastics to produce, because the process of using the segregated one is actually more expensive. And then you have models where some of the big corporations came together in Ghana and said, okay, fine. We are going to support businesses that actually are active in plastic recycling. So they supported one organization that used the plastic bottles to actually do a pavement for roads. They kind of developed bricks that could be used for pavement of roads. And those are the kind of small models that work. But then, again, the problem is how much can you scale that, to kind of create an impact that Florian, for example, will be interested in and say, I want to take this up because I know that I can actually scale this up across West Africa. So it's basically kind of trying to find a model that can work, attracting the right kind of partners. And as I was saying, if AGFUND really wants to do something, there is that missing space of how can we actually be the early seed funders for those organizations, kind of help them through that difficult space and process where there is actually hardly any seed funding at all, like grants, right? To be able to kind of scale them to a level where capital funds can actually say, fine, we'll actually take that and then reduce the risk of an investment and then use that to kind of help them scale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Venan. Mr. Jens, from OECD perspective, what can be done to boost the involvement of private sector in funding SDGs in Africa?
Well, I think maybe to say the OECD is an organization that has lots of statistics and data, but we're also very much a policy organization. So I think one example that I always found very striking about the impact of policies as a main driver of what you see happening in the country is actually, if you look at Korea, which basically 60 years ago was one of the poorest countries in the world. And it's interesting because you had sort of a country that has it's now two countries basically, but it's the same population, very homogeneous over hundreds of years. It's the same religion, it's same culture, same everything. But you can really see how, basically I would say in one part of Korea, you got sort of policies that were conducive to development, and in the other part not. And basically South Korea is now, after 60 years from coming as one of the poorest countries in the world, is one of the most prosperous societies on the planet. And it really goes to show the primary importance of policies, I think, to set the markets. And I think that's a key role for the international development community to continue supporting countries in their policy development, policy reform, but at the same time also on the capacity side. But at the same time, I also don't want to sort of downplay the financing, because I think there's a really catalytic impact that the development finance can play. And I think the key question there is really to see how can you sort of bridge a bit the divide between if you talk about mobilizing or catalyzing finance from financial markets into development, the question is, what is the nature of the supply and what is the nature of the demand there, basically? And there's often a mismatch. I mean, if you take big institutional investors, everybody's extremely interested in getting them because they have trillions of dollars under management. But at the same time, they're often very small, and they don't have many capacities. They rely on intermediaries, and they rely on highly standardized products, and basically they're happy if they can shift, $500 million on the click of a mouse, basically. So that shows a bit the problem. It's a bit the same problem that Van, you mentioned out in sort of the transaction costs involved in being able to invest and place your funding. And I think there's one key issue there around the capacity of due diligence, the capacity of proper risk assessments. There's a question of sort of the ability for development finance to provide risk mitigation in the right way for potential commercial financial investors. And again, there's, I think, a need to shift the focus away from sort of the incentive structures and benchmarks within sort of development finance institutions, from sort of focusing on ticket size, how much money do I need to disburse to meet my performance objectives. So it's really saying, how can I, reach sort of the highest development impact or the highest expected development impact, and how can I use the least own resources for that? How can I sort of crowd in as much commercial capital as possible? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, everybody goes around. It's well understood that development cooperation, development finance is in the business of getting itself out of business. And I think, fortunately, there are more and more opportunities where there's an opportunity to get yourself out of business, but I think we have to be a bit truer to ourselves sometimes in grasping that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jens. Now, Mr. Florian, we know that institutional investors has a huge amount of resources looking for good investment. How to bring this investment to fund financial inclusion, and by the same token, to contribute to SDGs achievement in West and Central Africa?
Yes, from a pure, let's say, business perspective, we look at three angles. We look at people, and the attention of people, and the skill set of people, and how to increase or look at what type of people or profile is needed in developing a company so that it becomes commercial. The second thing is capital. What type of capital? How is capital structured? Where's the capital coming from, and what are the intentions of the capital provider? Whether it's government, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's impact investing or pure financial side. And the third one is technology. And technology is actually probably the biggest impact investor overall in the recent 15 years in Africa has been the telecom companies, without even knowing it, just by providing communication and access through technology. And that's something where I think, as we are in a technology world, as we are in the fourth industrial revolution, everything is exponential, and where big companies have to look how they will survive in the future, this is probably one of the biggest blessings of Africa historically, because there is no incumbent technology. So you can see the wave of mobile telephony, from 1% 20 years back to 95% connected. The second thing is, through mobile telephony, through the same, by the way, providers, you have access to mobile money. And mobile money is a big game changer, where we in the past invested more in microfinance, financial inclusion, and helping non-for-profit lending institutions to become regulated banks. That was our major effort, looking on the equity side. Today, fintech, let's say the modern banking away from brick and mortar is probably the biggest impact on the population, and you can see how mobile money is adopted within a speed in Africa which is mind-blowing, not even known in our developed countries, understanding what's going on there. You have entire countries now, within a year or two, going big time in mobile money, paying taxes in mobile money. Everything is transparent. You go away from cash business. This is amazing, and you see also that as the pocket sizes of the population is increasing, the wealth is actually increasing, because through technology resolves the access and the affordability of goods and services. The third wave we're seeing now is off-grid solar. People talk about off-grid solar, and I'm not talking about renewable energy. I'm talking about the future where you will no longer pay for energy. Because energy is like internet, it's just there. You might pay for the infrastructure to provide it or to get access to. So you're going from an energy distribution, generation, hardwiring and selling your energy, to a distributed energy, where it's basically rooftop powered wherever you are. It's optimized on the energy you need, and you see mind-blowing models. We have in the off-grid energy space, we've invested in retail companies also doing very successfully, a lot of capital coming in. We have also invested in grid extension and microgrids and these things. But the most interesting model is, for example, one of the companies we've invested is called Bbox. It's extremely successful in Rwanda and Kenya, now going wide, really wide, even with joint ventures with big companies to wanting to run these distributed energies. Now, what energy does is not just the change from a feature phone to a smartphone. It's not that the population cannot pay for it, but if you don't have electricity, you cannot charge it. But what really is the transfer now, thanks to that, I get access to finance, because these units are financed and I pay as you go, or you said cook as you go. We're also working on a model for LPG gas, as pay as you go, the guys provided. But what that happens really is that the population gets access to information or the internet, and therefore distant learning, so there will be change on illiteracy just in the way, in a positive way, that you will much faster with modern ways have access to data, understand to read and write, but therefore also you can see, you mentioning, Venan, about the startups. It's amazing, the startups not just coming from Silicon Valley, but all over. Because today, if you want to start a business, you don't need a huge budget, and you don't need, a big funder. And that changes now back to the capital, back to your initial question is, how can we ensure that government money, philanthropic money, aid money, is a continuum of care so that these companies are incubated correctly, and the successful one also looked at what does it mean from a capacity point of view to become a real business, startup, and then commercial, to then grow. So from a pure impact investing point of view, I think it's a historical moment. It is amazing how technology is a blessing for these countries, and specifically the forgotten half of the world population, because now you can do business wherever you are. However, our job is to make sure that the capital structures are modern. We're no longer thinking about I only do philanthropy, I only do government, and I only do private, but we have to have constructive, interactions where we say, what capital can I provide? What do I want in order to make sure that the continuum of care is? Because just to finalize on our past is, we've invested with NGOs a lot around microfinance institutions. And we had tough times with them. Because an NGO was a philanthropic company, when we co-invested with them and we did a joint venture to basically the founder of a micro-lending institution was an NGO. We provided capital with them so that we could keep control and keep growing. And then we said, now we need to exit because now somebody else has to provide the money. And an NGO says, why would I? This is a successful bank, making a lot of money. I see the impact, I feel so good. So suddenly egos on the philanthropic side are hindering the success of a company to grow. I just wanted to provide some downsides also here.
Thank you.
I think we can't have better conclusions than what has been said. So at this stage, I would like to thank all the panelists and thank you all for this session. Thank you very much.